I knew something was wrong the moment I realized nobody had saved me a seat. My name is Claire Bennett, and for 17 years, I was married to Michael Bennett. For 17 years, I stood beside him through every promotion, every setback, every late-night worry, and every dream he was brave enough to chase. Yet on the morning of his funeral, as I stepped into the church where family and friends had gathered to say goodbye, I felt like a complete stranger. The sanctuary was already full. Soft music drifted through the room, and rows of white flowers surrounded a large photograph of Michael smiling the way I would always remember him. People filled the pews, speaking quietly, sharing memories, and offering comfort to one another. But not a single person looked in my direction. I paused near the entrance, expecting someone to wave me over. No one did. I scanned the room and noticed Eleanor Bennett, my mother-in-law, seated in the front row. Beside her sat Jason, Michael's younger brother. They were surrounded by relatives and close family friends. There were empty spaces beside them, but when Eleanor noticed me looking, she turned away as if she had not seen me at all. The feeling settled into my chest immediately. Something had changed. I walked slowly down the aisle, trying not to draw attention to myself. A few people offered polite smiles, but most avoided eye contact. It was strange. These were people I had spent holidays with. People who had sat around my dinner table. People who had called me family for nearly 2 decades. Yet now it felt as though I had never belonged there. Eventually I found a seat near the back of the church, alone. From there I watched as guests continued to arrive. Some embraced Eleanor. Others shook Jason's hand. Several people carried sympathy cards and small gifts. No one approached me. No one asked how I was holding up. No one asked if I needed anything. As I sat there, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. Near the front of the room stood a memorial display filled with photographs from Michael's life. Pictures from childhood, college graduation, family vacations, business events. But the wedding photo that had sat in our living room for years was nowhere to be found. Neither were any photographs of the two of us together. At first I thought it had to be a mistake. Then I noticed Jason standing beside the display, proudly talking to guests about how much work he had done organizing everything. That was when I understood it was not a mistake at all. Someone had carefully chosen which memories belonged in that room. And somehow, after 17 years of marriage, I had been erased from them. I looked toward Michael's photograph one more time, trying to understand why his family was acting this way. Then I remembered something he had told me months earlier. A quiet sentence spoken during an ordinary evening that had seemed unimportant at the time. One day, Claire, they will show you who they really are. Sitting alone in the back row of my husband's funeral, I finally began to understand what he meant. The service began a few minutes later, but I barely heard a word that was said. My attention kept drifting back to the memorial display near the front of the church. The more I looked at it, the more impossible it seemed. There were dozens of photographs. Michael as a child holding a fishing rod. Michael standing beside his father at a baseball game. Michael graduating from college. Michael celebrating business milestones. Michael with Jason. Michael with Eleanor. Michael with cousins, neighbors, and old friends. Yet somehow there was not a single photograph from our wedding day. Not one picture from the anniversary trips we had taken together. Not one image from the house we spent years building into a home. It was as if 17 years of marriage had simply vanished. I tried to tell myself there had to be a reasonable explanation, but deep down I knew better. This was deliberate. During the service, people stood one by one to share memories. Jason spoke first. He talked about Michael's work ethic and determination. Eleanor spoke next. She described him as a devoted son who always put family first. Others followed with stories from school, business, and community events. As I listened, I noticed something strange. Several stories left out important details. Moments I had lived through firsthand were being retold as if other people had been there instead of me. It felt less like a celebration of Michael's life and more like an effort to rewrite it. When the minister asked whether anyone else would like to speak, my heart skipped. For a brief second I thought perhaps someone would invite me forward. No one did. The silence stretched for a moment before the minister gently moved on. I sat frozen in my seat. The message was clear. They did not want my voice included. After the service ended, guests gathered in the reception hall attached to the church. Small groups formed around tables covered with coffee, sandwiches, and desserts. Once again I found myself alone. People who had known me for years offered quick nods before turning back to their conversations. Then I overheard something that made me stop walking. Two distant relatives were standing near a window speaking quietly. They did not realize I was close enough to hear. "I wonder what happens to her now," one woman said. "Probably not much," the other replied. "Everything stays with the Bennetts, I assume." They both glanced in my direction before lowering their voices further. I continued walking as if I had heard nothing, but their words stayed with me. Why was everyone so certain about what would happen next? A few minutes later, I stepped outside for air. The afternoon sky was grey, and the parking lot was nearly full. As I stood there alone, trying to steady myself, I heard footsteps behind me. An older man in a dark suit approached and handed me a sealed envelope. Before I could ask who he was, he simply said, "This was left for you." I looked down at the envelope. There was no return address. No signature. Only my name written neatly across the front. Claire Bennett. Suddenly Michael's words echoed in my mind again. One day, they will show you who they really are. With trembling hands, I opened the envelope and unfolded the single sheet inside. Written in the center of the page were 6 words that immediately changed everything. Stay until the lawyer arrives. I read the note 3 times before I could convince myself the words were real. Stay until the lawyer arrives. That was it. No signature. No explanation. Just 6 words. Yet something about them felt unmistakably familiar. Michael had always been careful with his words. He never wasted them. If he wanted me to know something, he would say only what was necessary and trust me to understand the rest. Standing alone outside the church, I folded the note carefully and slipped it into my purse. For the first time all day, I felt something other than grief. I felt curiosity. The reception continued inside, and when I returned, the atmosphere had changed. Most guests were preparing to leave. People gathered coats, exchanged final condolences, and slowly filtered toward the parking lot. I noticed Jason standing near one of the tables, speaking confidently with a group of relatives. As I walked past, I heard part of the conversation. "Michael always knew family came first," Jason said. He wanted things kept simple. Several people nodded in agreement. Then one of them asked, "Have you spoken with the attorney yet?" Jason smiled. "Not officially. But I think we all know what Michael would have wanted." The group laughed softly. When Jason noticed me nearby, the conversation stopped immediately. An awkward silence settled over the table. Nobody said anything unkind, but nobody welcomed me either. I continued walking and found a quiet corner near a window. Outside, the late afternoon sun was beginning to break through the clouds. I remembered another conversation with Michael from nearly a year earlier. We had been sitting on our back porch after dinner. There was nothing remarkable about the evening. The neighborhood was quiet. The air was warm. We were talking about ordinary things when Michael suddenly became thoughtful. "Have you ever noticed how people behave differently when they think something belongs to them?" he asked. I laughed and told him it sounded like one of his business lessons. But he had not laughed. Instead, he stared into the distance and said, "Sometimes people show their true character long before they realize anyone is watching." At the time, I did not understand why he sounded so serious. Now, surrounded by relatives who barely acknowledged my existence, I could not stop thinking about it. An hour later, only close family remained. Eleanor gathered several relatives near the entrance and announced that everyone should head to the Bennett family home. "There are a few matters we need to discuss," she said. Nobody questioned her authority. As people prepared to leave, I noticed something else. Not a single person invited me to join them. They simply assumed I would not be coming. Eleanor walked past me without making eye contact. Jason followed a few moments later. Then I heard him quietly say to another relative, "By tonight, everything should finally be settled. Everything should finally be settled." The confidence in his voice caught my attention. It sounded less like hope and more like certainty. As the room emptied, I reached into my purse and touched the folded note again. "Stay until the lawyer arrives." Whatever Michael had meant for me to discover had not happened yet. And for the first time that day, I was absolutely certain that leaving would be a mistake. Within 30 minutes, the church was nearly empty. Volunteers were clearing tables and stacking chairs while the last guests drifted toward the parking lot. I remained seated near the window, watching the sunlight slowly fade across the floor. Part of me wanted to leave. I was exhausted, emotionally drained, and still trying to understand why Michael's family had spent the entire day pretending I barely existed. But every time I considered walking out, I remembered the note. "Stay until the lawyer arrives." I checked my phone. There were no new messages. No missed calls. Nothing that explained who had sent the envelope or why. Another 20 minutes passed before I finally saw movement near the entrance. A man in a navy suit walked into the reception hall carrying a leather briefcase. He looked to be in his early 60s, with silver hair and a calm expression. The moment he entered, several volunteers immediately greeted him. One of them pointed in my direction. The man nodded politely and began walking toward me. My pulse quickened. When he reached my table, he extended his hand. "Mrs. Bennett?" he asked. "Yes," I replied. "My name is Richard Hayes." The name sounded familiar. Then I remembered. Michael had mentioned him before. Richard Hayes had been his attorney for years. "I apologize for the delay," he said. "There were a few matters that required attention." He glanced around the nearly empty room before lowering his voice slightly. "I believe there are several people waiting at the Bennett residence." I nodded. I was not invited. A faint expression crossed his face. It was not surprise. If anything, it looked more like confirmation. "I see," he said quietly. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then he carefully set his briefcase on the table. "Mrs. Bennett, before we leave, there is something I would like to ask." My heart began beating faster. "Of course." He studied me for a second. "Did Michael ever tell you to stay until I arrived?" The question sent a chill through me. Slowly, I reached into my purse and removed the folded note. Richard looked at it and nodded before I even opened it. "Then he planned this," he said. "Planned what?" I asked. Richard hesitated, as though choosing his words carefully. Michael was a thoughtful man. He prepared for many possibilities. That was all he would say. Before I could ask another question, he closed his briefcase and stood. "We should go." The drive to the Bennett family home took about 15 minutes. I followed Richard in my car, my mind racing the entire way. When we arrived, the large house was already full. Luxury vehicles lined the driveway. Through the windows I could see relatives gathered in small groups, talking and laughing far more comfortably than people usually did on the day of a funeral. As I walked toward the front door, I noticed Jason standing inside the foyer. He was smiling confidently while speaking with several family members. Then he looked up and saw me. The smile disappeared immediately. The room grew noticeably quieter. Every eye seemed to turn in my direction at once. And for the first time all day, I realized they were not surprised to see the attorney. They were surprised to see me standing beside him. The silence that followed my arrival felt heavier than anything I had experienced all day. Conversations stopped midway through sentences. Several relatives exchanged uncomfortable glances. Others suddenly became interested in their coffee cups or phones. Jason was the first to recover. He forced a smile and walked toward Richard Hayes. "Good to see you, Richard," he said confidently. "We have all been waiting." Richard nodded politely but offered nothing more. He did not return the smile. Instead, he looked around the room and asked a simple question. "Is everyone who needs to be here present?" Eleanor stepped forward immediately. "Yes," she replied. "The family is here." The way she emphasized the word family was impossible to miss. For a brief moment her eyes shifted toward me before returning to Richard. I understood exactly what she meant. In her mind, I was no longer part of that group. Richard glanced at me, then back at Eleanor. "Good," he said calmly. "Then we can begin." We moved into Michael's study, a room that had always been one of my favorite places in the house. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined the walls. Family photographs sat on side tables. The large oak desk where Michael spent countless evenings working remained exactly where it had always been. Yet tonight the room felt different. It no longer felt like a place filled with memories. It felt like a courtroom. Chairs were arranged in a semicircle facing the desk. Jason immediately chose a seat closest to Richard. Eleanor sat beside him. Several relatives filled the remaining chairs. Nobody offered me a place near the front. I quietly selected a seat toward the back and waited. As people settled in, conversations continued in hushed voices. I could not help noticing how confident everyone seemed. One cousin spoke openly about keeping certain family heirlooms. Another discussed future plans for the lake cabin Michael owned. Jason even mentioned renovations he intended to make to the house. Listening to them felt surreal. The decision sounded finalized, as though the outcome had already been determined long before Richard arrived. Then I remembered another moment from several months earlier. Michael and I had been organizing old paperwork in this very room. At one point he held a document in his hand and looked at me with unusual seriousness. "Promise me something," he said. "If anything unexpected happens, do not let other people tell you what your place is." I laughed at the time and asked why he was speaking so dramatically. He never answered directly. Instead, he simply smiled and changed the subject. Sitting in his study now, I wished I had pressed him for an explanation. Richard finally opened his briefcase and removed several folders. The room immediately fell silent. Every eye focused on the documents in front of him. Jason leaned forward eagerly. Eleanor folded her hands in her lap. The anticipation was almost visible. Richard adjusted his glasses and carefully organized the papers. Then he looked around the room one final time. "Before we proceed," he said, "there is one matter I need to clarify." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Richard's gaze settled on me. "Mrs. Bennett, would you please come sit here beside me?" The entire room froze. The confidence vanished from Jason's face. Eleanor looked genuinely stunned. And as I slowly stood from my chair, I realized this was the moment Michael had been preparing me for all along. For several seconds, nobody moved. The request seemed so simple, yet it changed the atmosphere of the room completely. I could feel every pair of eyes following me as I walked toward the front of Michael's study. Jason looked confused. Eleanor looked offended. A few relatives exchanged nervous glances, as if they had suddenly realized they might not understand the situation as well as they thought. Richard pulled out the chair beside him and waited until I was seated. Then he folded his hands and looked around the room. "Thank you," he said calmly. "Now we may begin." The silence that followed was almost unbearable. Richard opened the first folder and removed a document. "This is the last will and testament of Michael Bennett," he announced. Several people immediately leaned forward. Jason practically sat on the edge of his chair. Richard continued. "The document was reviewed, updated, and legally executed approximately 8 months ago." I noticed Jason's expression brighten. He clearly believed everything was proceeding exactly as expected. Richard began reading several standard legal passages. Most of the room listened patiently. Others appeared distracted, eager to reach the important parts. Then Richard turned a page and paused. The room became completely still. The first personal statement included in this document reads as follows. He adjusted his glasses and began reading. To my family, friends, and loved ones, if you are hearing these words, I am no longer able to speak for myself. Therefore I ask that you listen carefully, because every decision contained in this document was made deliberately and without pressure from any person. Jason crossed his arms. Eleanor stared straight ahead. Richard continued reading. The people who truly care about you reveal themselves during difficult times, not comfortable ones. My breath caught in my throat. Those words sounded exactly like Michael. The same quiet wisdom he had shared throughout our marriage. Richard turned another page. Before any distribution of assets is discussed, I want one matter addressed first. Every person in the room focused on him. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Richard looked directly at me before reading the next sentence. The person I trusted most during the final years of my life was my wife, Claire Bennett. A visible shock moved through the room. Jason's confident expression disappeared instantly. Eleanor blinked several times as though she had misheard. One cousin actually shifted in his seat and looked toward me in disbelief. Richard continued. Claire stood beside me through every challenge, every success, and every uncertainty. She supported me when no one else knew there was a burden to carry. The room remained silent. I felt my eyes begin to fill with tears. Not because of money. Not because of inheritance. But because for the first time that day, I could hear Michael's voice again through the words he had left behind. Richard carefully placed the page on the desk. Then he opened a second folder that appeared even thicker than the first. The next section concerns Michael's specific instructions, he said. Jason immediately sat upright again. Hope returned to his face. He clearly believed the important part was finally coming. But before continuing, Richard looked around the room and said something that caused every ounce of confidence to vanish once more. I should warn everyone present. What follows may be very different from what you have been expecting. The warning hung in the air long after Richard finished speaking. Nobody interrupted him. Nobody challenged him. The confidence that had filled the room earlier was fading rapidly, replaced by uncertainty. Richard opened the second folder and carefully removed several pages. Michael included a personal explanation regarding the decisions that follow, he said. Then he began reading. Over the last several years, I learned an important lesson. Loyalty is easy when life is comfortable. True character appears when sacrifice is required. The room remained silent. Richard continued. Many people assumed they understood my priorities. Some even assumed they understood my intentions. Unfortunately, assumptions are not the same as truth. Jason shifted in his seat. Eleanor folded her arms tightly. I could see the growing discomfort on their faces. Richard turned another page. There were times when I faced challenges that very few people knew about. During those moments, I paid close attention to who showed up, who listened, and who genuinely cared. I felt my throat tighten. I knew exactly what Michael was referring to. There had been difficult years. Years when business pressures followed him home. Years when unexpected problems kept him awake at night. Through all of it, we faced those challenges together. Richard continued reading. Claire never asked what she would gain. She never measured her support in dollars or favors. She remained beside me because she loved me and because she believed commitment meant something even when circumstances became difficult. Several relatives lowered their eyes. Others stared at the floor. Nobody seemed eager to make eye contact anymore. Then Richard paused and removed a sealed envelope from the folder. Michael instructed that this letter be read before any assets are discussed. The room became completely still once again. Richard opened the envelope and unfolded the letter. If Claire is present while this letter is being read, then she honored my final request. My heart nearly stopped. Richard looked toward me briefly before continuing. Claire, if you are hearing these words, then you already know how much I loved you. What you may not know is how carefully I observed the people around us during the final years of my life. Jason's expression hardened. Eleanor stared straight ahead without speaking. I realized that some individuals were more interested in what I owned than in who I was. That realization was painful, but it was also necessary. Because it showed me exactly who I could trust. The room felt smaller with every sentence. Richard continued reading. I asked Richard Hayes to help me create a plan that would reveal character before revealing consequences. That is why certain instructions were kept private. Suddenly several events from the day began making sense. The missing photographs. The cold treatment. The assumption that I did not belong. Michael had anticipated all of it. He knew how people would behave once they believed the future was already theirs. Richard reached the final paragraph of the letter. The next decisions contained in this document are not rewards. They are reflections of trust. Every choice was made after careful thought. Every instruction represents what I truly wanted. Richard folded the letter and placed it back on the desk. Nobody spoke. The room was completely silent. Then he opened the final section of the folder and looked directly at the family gathered before him. We will now begin reviewing Michael's specific distributions and appointments. The expression on Jason's face revealed that he was preparing himself for good news. But something told me he had not understood Michael's letter at all. And based on the calm look in Richard's eyes, the biggest surprise of the night was still waiting to be revealed. Richard organized the final documents into separate stacks before continuing. The room remained silent, but the atmosphere had completely changed. Earlier, everyone had entered the study expecting confirmation of what they already believed. Now uncertainty sat on every face. Nobody looked comfortable anymore. Richard cleared his throat and began reading. In addition to my personal letter, I have designated one individual to oversee the execution of my estate, business interests, charitable commitments, and personal directives. Jason immediately leaned forward. I could almost see the expectation returning to his expression. For years he had assumed he would eventually take over much of Michael's responsibility. Several relatives seemed to share the same assumption. Richard glanced down at the document. The person appointed as sole executor and primary decision-maker is Claire Bennett. For a moment nobody reacted. It was as though the words needed time to register. Then several people exchanged startled looks. Jason's eyes widened. Eleanor sat completely still. Richard continued before anyone could interrupt. This appointment grants Claire Bennett full authority to oversee all instructions contained within this estate plan. The room felt frozen. I sat motionless, trying to absorb what I had just heard. Michael had never mentioned this responsibility. Not once. Yet suddenly I understood why he had insisted that trust mattered more than assumptions. Richard moved to the next section. Michael also established a private charitable foundation to support educational scholarships and community development programs. Administration of that foundation shall remain under the supervision of Claire Bennett. More surprised glances spread across the room. The foundation was one of Michael's proudest achievements. He had spent years discussing ways to create opportunities for young people. The fact that he trusted me with that responsibility meant more than any financial figure ever could. Then Richard opened another document. Finally, Michael included a personal statement regarding his family. The room grew quiet again. Richard began reading. To my family, I hope you understand that love and trust are not identical. Love may be given freely. Trust must be earned repeatedly through actions. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. My decisions were not made to punish anyone. They were made to reflect the relationships that existed in reality rather than the relationships people assumed existed. I noticed several relatives looking uncomfortable. Others stared at the floor. Jason folded his arms tightly across his chest. Richard continued. If anyone feels disappointed by these decisions, I encourage them to remember that opportunities to strengthen relationships existed long before this document was written. The words landed heavily throughout the room. There was no anger in them. No bitterness. Only honesty. And somehow that made them even more powerful. Richard finished reading and carefully placed the document aside. Then he turned toward me. Mrs. Bennett, there is one final item. He reached into the folder and removed a small sealed envelope with my name written across the front in Michael's handwriting. My breath caught instantly. Unlike the letter that had been read aloud, this one was addressed only to me. Richard handed it across the desk. Michael instructed that this be delivered personally after all other statements had been completed. I stared at the envelope for several seconds. Around me, nobody spoke. Every person in the room seemed aware that this final message carried special significance. Slowly, I broke the seal and unfolded the letter inside. The first sentence alone was enough to bring tears to my eyes. It began with 7 simple words. Claire, there is something I never told you. My hands trembled as I continued reading the letter. The room around me seemed to disappear. For the first time all day, it felt as though Michael was speaking directly to me. Claire, there is something I never told you. Not because I wanted to keep a secret from you, but because I knew one day you would discover it at exactly the right moment. I wanted you to see people clearly before you saw the full picture. I swallowed hard and continued. The greatest gift I can leave behind is not property, money, or authority. It is certainty. Certainty about who truly cared. Certainty about your own strength. And certainty that you never needed anyone's approval to know your worth. Tears filled my eyes. Throughout the day I had questioned myself. I had wondered whether I belonged in this family. Whether I had somehow become invisible. Whether 17 years of loyalty and love had meant less than I believed. Michael's words answered every one of those doubts. When you walked into the funeral, some people saw an obstacle. Others saw a future opportunity. Very few saw a grieving wife. That is why I asked Richard to wait. That is why I left instructions. I wanted actions to reveal character before explanations change behavior. The room remained silent as I read. Nobody interrupted. Nobody objected. Do not waste energy being angry. People reveal themselves eventually. Some do it through kindness. Others do it through entitlement. Either way, the truth always arrives. I lowered the letter for a moment and looked around the study. Earlier that day I had felt isolated. Now I saw something different. I saw people forced to confront their own choices. Nobody had treated me cruelly. In many ways, what hurt most was something simpler. They had dismissed me. They had decided I no longer mattered before hearing a single word from the man they claimed to love. I looked back at the letter. The final paragraph was short. Live your life fully. Continue helping others. Continue building what matters. And whenever you doubt yourself, remember this. Out of everyone in my life, you were the person I trusted most. I folded the letter carefully. For several seconds nobody spoke. Then Richard quietly gathered the documents and closed the folders. The legal process was complete. Michael's wishes had been made clear. The room that had once been filled with certainty now felt humbled by reality. Jason finally lowered his eyes. Eleanor sat silently staring at the desk. No arguments followed. No dramatic confrontations. Nothing needed to be said. Michael had already said everything. After a few minutes, people slowly began leaving the study. Some offered polite goodbyes. Others simply walked away. The confidence and assumptions that had filled the room earlier were gone. When the last few relatives departed, I remained seated for a moment, holding Michael's letter. The house felt quiet. Peaceful. For the first time since the funeral began, I felt calm. I stood. thanked Richard for honoring Michael's wishes, and walked toward the front door. As I stepped outside, the evening sky was painted with shades of gold and blue. A gentle breeze moved through the trees. I looked up for a moment and smiled. The day had begun with rejection, confusion, and loneliness. It ended with clarity. Michael had not left me a lesson about inheritance. He had left me a lesson about trust. And as I walked toward my car, carrying nothing more than a folded letter and the truth it contained, I realized that was worth more than anything else he could have given me.